Even though rent in the Valley has somewhat cooled down, we know that many people are one financial emergency away from an eviction notice. Today on CityCast Las Vegas, I get to talk to Michael Lyle, a reporter from the Nevada Current, about what our lawmakers are trying to do to keep housing affordable. It's Monday, May 1st. I'm Vogue Robinson, and here's what Las Vegas is talking about. Good morning, Michael Lyle. Welcome back to CityCast Las Vegas. How are you?
Good morning, Vogue. I'm doing awesome. How are you doing today?
I'm okay. We're going to get this pain medicine and make it through. Today, we're talking about rent stabilization, but a lot of people are more familiar with rent control. So, Michael, what's the difference between those two things?
Yeah, absolutely. People get those conflated all the time. Rent control is more when you freeze that rent price in place, so it can't go up at all. Stabilization, you can increase it, but it sets a cap on how much it can be increased by. And so right now we're looking at legislation that deals more with how much that rent can be raised.
So really, it's like, okay, rent stabilization is reasonable increase in communication between the tenant and the renter, versus rent control is like, leave it alone. The rent is the rent.
Absolutely, because we know right now these rent prices are out of control. Seeing, I think on a statewide level and county level, we're seeing 20 to 30% increases. But what that looks like is some people getting higher. Like you have people are saying that they had their rent increase $200, $300, $400, $500, like from year to year. No one can afford that.
Nope. Why is it so hard to pass rent control and stabilization laws in our valley?
I think it's been hard to talk about rent stabilization or addressing these high rents because of a couple of reasons. One, counties and cities not sure if they have the power, if there's a willingness to do anything about it, both from local and statewide politicians. I think there's been a lot of opposition towards anything to deal with rent stabilization or addressing tenant protections. We've long seen opposition to that. And so I think that's why we have not seen anything addressing the rent, but we're kind of reaching the point again where rent has raised so much and so many people are at the verge of homelessness and houselessness that there's no other option right now. And state officials have to do something. They have to respond to the crisis at hand or homelessness is going to explode.
All I see is that old, like the meme that was like, the rent is too damn high. Like, it's just like, we're not going to take it anymore. It's gone too far. So how many different methods were proposed to address rent stabilization in this legislative session?
So there are about 4 dealing specifically with rent increases on various levels. Some are a little bit more narrow what they're trying to cap. And then there's a separate proposal that's also cleaning up language to ensure that counties and cities, if they wanted to, could do something like rent control. And so we can get into the nitty-gritty on what that looks like too.
Okay. So what were some of the broadest bills introduced?
The broadest one introduced was a 5% cap on rents increasing. And that had some carve outs, though, wouldn't apply to mom and pop landlords, someone that maybe is renting out a spare room, but one specific house that they wanted to rent out. The broadest one wouldn't apply to new constructions for a set amount of time either. And so it's broad in the sense that it caps rent at 5%, but it does have some carve outs for who it applies to. Landlords could also apply for exemptions through the Nevada Housing Division if they feel that they need to raise the rent more than 5%. Say they're doing renovations on the property. There's other circumstances why they feel they need to raise the rent more than 5%. They can apply for those exemptions and potentially get approved, but they would also have to notify their tenants that they're applying for their exemptions before anything would go through.
I appreciate that because, yeah, I mean, like, our neighborhood, they were like, we're putting in a park. So this bill goes up and I was like, oh, thanks. Like, I don't want to pay that. So that's one broad measure introduced. What was the other one?
So another measure they're looking at is explicitly giving counties and cities the ability to address housing, whether that is rent control or whatnot. So right now, Nevada is what's called a Dillon's Rule state, and that is a governing principle that essentially limits local powers, so city government, county governments, to only do that things that are expressly granted by the states. And so for that reason, many counties and cities think they can't do rent control or can't can do rent stabilization or can't do anything to address housing. However, there was a carve out legislation in the 2015 session, and the intent behind that, the legislative intent behind that, was to give a little bit more authority to local governments. The Legislative Council Bureau has maintained over the last 8 years that local governments do have the ability to address affordable housing, whether it's rent stabilization or whatnot. But counties and cities keep arguing, no, we do not. We don't think that we have this power. And so there's been this back and forth. That back and forth really hit a peak, obviously, in the last year when these rents went out of control and people were like, hey, counties, cities, can you do something? And they're like, we don't have the power. The state doesn't give us the power. And the state saying, yes, you do have the power. And so there's legislation that expressly gives the cities and counties the authority to enact any ordinance or measure relating to affordable housing. And that includes, as an example, rent control. That's literally in the legislation.
Wow.
And so this would actually just assure the counties and cities, yeah, you do have the power. Now, whether or not they want to authorize that power, whether it's rent stabilization, whether it's other measures to grow affordable housing, that is up to them if this legislation would pass. But this bill would just kind of just clarify what their abilities are.
With great power comes great responsibility. So, what are the more targeted, narrow bills that we're seeing in the legislature?
So one of the more targeted ones is rent stabilization for fixed income population. So that's seniors and people living on disability. So this would actually be almost a pilot program where we have a start date. If this would pass, it would begin in July and end in December of 2024, where it would essentially say if you're of these populations, fixed income seniors, your rent cannot be raised more than 10%. And so the idea of that is fixed income seniors obviously not bringing in more any more income, and so can't afford these outrageous rent increases, and so very vulnerable of homelessness right now. And the bill sponsor said, hey, we pilot this program. This gives our state a better look at if rent stabilization policy actually works. And so if we don't like this, we don't have to go forward with it beyond this year. If this does work for our state, if this is something we want to expand, we can do that in the following legislative session, because that would feed into the 2025 legislator.
Oh, okay. So it's like a bill saying, let's test out this policy. And if it doesn't work at the end of the test, then we can go back to the drawing board.
Exactly. And it's a specific vulnerable group that we're testing it out on, that we all can agree we don't want to see living on the streets. We don't want to see 65-year-olds living on the streets, do we? Like, we don't want to see anyone living on the streets.
But like, yeah, come on.
And then there's also another proposal that is actually looking at capping increases for the spaces rents for manufactured homes. So at manufactured home parks, like, you own your mobile home, but then you rent the space that it resides on. Some of these communities are finding they're being bought out by larger entities. And so with that are coming huge increases to the spaces that are being rent. And so this bill actually would look at capping some of those rent increases too. And so kind of similar, you see some of the similar populations living in manufactured home communities. And so just assuring that, like, the space that they're renting is not capped, because it's harder to move those manufactured homes around and find, like, suitable spaces. And so just putting some regulation on how much those spaces can be raised.
So, I mean, when we talk about this, okay, so it's people who living in manufactured homes and then, our 55 plus community. Who are the most vulnerable in our community when it comes to rent increases?
Everyone. Like, so we want to talk about, like, let's be real. Let's be real. We want to talk about seniors. We want to talk about people with disabilities and people with fixed incomes, which is, I believe, obviously a vulnerable population. They are living on fixed incomes. They're not bringing any more income. But the truth of the matter is, people aren't making what they need to make to afford the rents. We've seen that in so many different studies. Last year, UNLV did a study and found 6 out of the 10 top professions in Southern Nevada and 7 out of the 10 occupations in Northern Nevada could not afford the rent for a studio apartment. We don't have enough rental units to begin with, and rents are increasing and they're not matching what wages are out there for even the jobs that make our city run. So the truthful answer is everyone is vulnerable to these rent increases. We've heard the statistic so much. I think I can't even remember where it even stems from, but it's the fact that most people can't afford a $400 emergency, whether it's a car breaking down, a medical emergency, and that's enough to undo any type of stability that they have to push them out of housing. The truth is, everyone is vulnerable when it comes to housing insecurity and it comes to rents being too damn high and being on the verge of homelessness.
Yeah, I definitely understand that because a couple of $100 for some people may not be very much, but if there are no parameters for how high rent can be or whether or not people get informed about it, then yeah, I feel like you could possibly get blindsided by like, oh, here's a 30, 40, 50% increase on your rent. And that might not be in your capacity to handle, especially if it's going to change over really quickly. Are there any of those that are getting a lot of support that you think, yes, like that one's probably going to pass?
Yeah, so I would say the rent stabilization for seniors, that is definitely something that has a little bit more support, especially among Democrats. So I would imagine out of all the bills that actually look at rent stabilization, that would pass. Ironically, the bill that clarifies local government's power has some Republican support and also some Democratic opposition. When it passed out of
Huh.
committee, it was actually the Republicans that helped pass it out of committee. One Republican say, hey, if we're going to talk about rent stabilization, I'd much rather the counties and cities do it on their level and not us mandating it, with a Democrat on that committee saying, no, 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 I'd rather us mandate it. And then seeing the counties and cities come up with their proposals. And so I think that has some traction just because it's going to get some Republican support and maybe even get Governor Lombardo to sign on. But again, it would just open up the possibility for cities and counties to do this. It wouldn't mandate anything. And so I think that might also draw some more appeal and some more support because of that appeal.
Hmm. I could see that because it's like, oh, I feel like that's right in alignment with people who fight for states' rights. It's like, no, give the people who live in the area the power to make the decisions about what's right for them. So I could see some Republican support there. Huh. Okay, that's interesting.
These are the things that live rent free in my mind. See what I did there?
I do see what you did there. Look at you. I know there were more than a few bills that were introduced for rent stabilization, but I know not all of them even made it to the session. So, for the ones that did die, why do you think that they didn't make it?
So there is a mirror piece of legislation in the assembly that did exactly the same language that the rent stabilization in the Senate that is going through, that did pass out of committee and now is in finance. And so I would say the only reason that it did die was just because I don't know this definitively, but I would imagine that because it was such similar language, and the Senate bill actually had more sponsors and co-sponsors attached to it than the assembly piece of legislation. That's the only reason it didn't get a hearing. And then also assembly leadership, like they have that rent stabilization pilot program for fixed income communities. And so I think that's what they're leaning on too. So probably a couple of reasons why that didn't go through, but I would argue it's mostly because there's similar language in the Senate side and that's already getting its hearing. And so no reason to reinvent the wheel.
Word. Do you think there are any other like groups that are staunchly against rent control and rent stabilization?
I mean, the Apartment Association, Nevada Realtors, property managers, they're generally against these. And then you have, niche groups, like whether it's like libertarian groups and Republican groups that, free market, just spit that out all the time. Free market. And so they're against any type of rent stabilization. My gosh, how many libertarians are about to reach out to me just because I just said that? Apologies to my mentions.
But I mean, like if they've come out and publicly spoken against, some of these policies, then I think that they called themselves out. So when I think about, the overall goal is to make sure that living in the city is an affordable thing, that, that people are not left high and dry and just out on the streets. I feel like that's the purpose of all of this legislation. That's what people are fighting for. And like you were saying, everybody really can be vulnerable to this. So I'm wondering why aren't the different groups that are proposing the bills, like why not consolidate efforts and come up with one bill for rent stabilization?
That is an excellent question. I don't have a definitive answer, but I would imagine just because there are different ideas of how we should tackle this problem. I think no one, and I mean no one, disagrees that we have a housing crisis, but everyone has a different thought of how we tackle this crisis, even when it comes to how we regulate rent prices. And so we're seeing that reflected in the different types of legislation. And so I think we're not seeing a packaged bill. It's just because those ideas are playing out individually in the legislative session. And I don't think there is not even a cohesion among Democrats to say about how we tackle this and how we respond to industry groups that are against this. And even if we should tackle this on a statewide level or local level.
Right. I would think it's different in a larger city like Las Vegas than it is for maybe in Ely. That each of these cities kind of has a different sort of ecosystem. So, maybe more people own in other smaller cities. Like you never know what people need. So I could understand that for sure. Michael Lyle, thank you so much for being on CityCast Las Vegas. Man, you broke this all the way down. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Now for a little news. What's going on, David?
Well, Vogue, before the Oakland A's set their sights on their current proposed stadium location, they were offered 22 acres adjacent to the Rio Hotel for the low, low price of $1. You heard that right. The team apparently wasn't interested, and now it's reportedly seeking $500 million in public financing. Well, for a team in last place, that bad math totally tracks. Also, it looks like local eateries account for nearly 1/4 of Yelp's 100 top-rated restaurants of the whole Southwest. The highest rated of the 22 Las Vegas joints is one over on Durango called Garlic Yuzu. It came in at number 2 on the list. Others include Aroma Latin American Cocina and Zeneda's Cafe. Lastly, a listener texted us in response to last Monday's episode on graduation regalia saying, I disagree with high school decorations of the grad cap on grounds that, unlike college, which is very individualistic education, high school is meant to bestow that we are all the same, equal, from this point on. It is the reason we train for adulthood, and too many of our ceremonies for that idea are militaristic. High school is a great moment for that, so it should remain a uniform look.
That's all for today here on CityCast Las Vegas. If you enjoyed the show, go ahead and tell a friend. Rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Stay hydrated. It's so funny. I typed when you were talking WWGLD, like what would Governor Lombardo do? And I was like, oh, I don't think anybody wants that bracelet. But it's an interesting question.